welcome to you all from the metals industry throughout Europe, I think the wider Europe. It's a pleasure to have you with us here on what is our final Metals Meet MEPs webinar of this series. We have addressed, of course, everything from trade and industrial policy through to climate legislation in our previous settings with MEPs. And today we're talking about the sustainable chemical strategy. And our question is, how can we move towards a non-toxic environment whilst also enabling Europe to have access to the metals that it needs to deliver on the Green Deal? As you know, we talked about in the past series, demand for metals is likely to increase exponentially. Already, in terms of the volume that we're talking about, inorganics, of which metals play a role, are the largest in terms of volume of registered chemicals in Europe, I am told. Clearly, chemical regulation has an impact on how the industry looks at Europe in terms of investment and access to market. So we're going to be talking about how chemicals, climate and circularity all fit together. To help me in that discussion, people who know far more than I do, we have Guy Ethier, who's an SVP at Umicore. Many of you around Europe will know him well. Focuses on the sustainability aspects of batteries, particularly cobalt in recent years. Welcome, Guy. We also have Maria Spyraki, who many of you will have come into contact with, joined us down in Strasbourg over this year, Greek EPP member from the Industry Committee, also a substitute on ENVI, and currently leading the charge of the European Parliament in its motion for resolution on the said chemical strategy. And finally, to complete our panelists, Bjorn Hansen, of course, Executive Director of ECHA in his second term in that role, previously head of unit at DG Environment, and also many of you on the line, I'm sure, remember him from his time at ECB and elsewhere. Welcome all three of you to the discussion. I'm going to start off, if I may, with Guy. Guy, you come from Umicore, clearly one of those kind of European champions in the metal sector, looking for growth in Europe, investing in Europe. I'm interested from you, as a view from your company, what do you need from the forthcoming chemicals, sustainable chemicals strategy to continue to invest and invest in the kind of clean technologies that Europe needs in the Green Deal? Guy.
James, first of all, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for our co-participant here on the panel. Thanks for the statement about the leadership. Indeed, at Umicore, as you know, we've made this huge transformation to focus our mind on three basic areas of resource scarcity, e-mobility, and clean air. I say this because this is extremely important when it comes to chemical policy. Metals in general. The majority of the Mendeleev table, so there are a lot of chemicals, are at the center of this transformation we're going through in terms of energy and transport, and in coming out of the carbon industry. So it is absolutely essential that the governments in Europe in particular provides us with the necessary regulatory framework in order to ensure that we have access to the right type of material. So the issue of resource feeding and is absolutely important. So the sourcing and the element of sourcing are extremely important. I just want to remind you that in order to meet our target on climate, we're probably going to need 500 times more of things like cobalt and lithium and others. So, I mean, it's extremely important that, the policy framework is such that it's conducive to access of material. The second thing is that the policy framework is conducive for the operation to happen in Europe. We're working in a competitive world. It's extremely important that the policy and the framework are allowing for the development locally, and they're not putting extraordinary burden because, operations doesn't have to necessarily happen in Europe. So we want it to happen in Europe as an operator, but so the framework is extremely important. The second area is, the entire area of the greenhouse gases. I say this because, the operations becomes very important, and the emissions in use is important. So it has to be conducive. Policy around chemicals has to be conducive to allow material to replace carbon-based material in order to allow for this new transition we need on mobility and energy supply. And the last part is definitely the circular economy. We need policies that allows for material to be reused, end of life, either reused or recycled. We need to get out of this mindset of waste. So when it comes to regulatory policy and regulatory framework, again, we need policies that are conducive to material recovery and not calling them waste anymore. But all of this has to happen in a way that we allow for partnership along the value chain. We're in a different mode now. It is extremely important that we partner with governments, with intergovernmental agencies, with NGOs into a totally different mindset. It's the days of competition around those elements are gone. We have to have these partnership in a pre-competitive manner. I have a statement here that we need upstream, downstream, and shake, and only the partners government into the future. So it's needed. Last point, I'll finish with that, James, is the resilience of the system. I mean, the current COVID crisis has highlighted the importance of any systems to be resilient. So, chemical policy has to help us to be resilient, to continue into the future. And with metals and with this transition we're living, unfortunately, not all the materials come from this part of the world. So policy framework with chemicals has to allow for a proper global resilience. And I would suggest that, resources are a common good. And when it comes to policy and framework, it has to be done in a consistent fashion around the globe. So Bjorn and I go along many years, and I think with international policies along with the local policies here, it's absolutely important that we have consistent approaches.
Thank you, Guy. And you touched upon many of the things I hope we'll come back to as we continue the conversation. We've heard a lot, I think, in our discussions over recent weeks on these webinars around the importance of value chains and taking value chain approaches and trying to keep much of that value chain on those strategic industries inside Europe. And I also heard the call for partnerships there. I'll come to Bjorn in a minute, but I do think of the important work already being done in partnership with ECHA, between Eurometaux and ECHA on the MESA partnership that you already have. Before I do come to you, Bjorn, though, I'm going to turn to Maria. Maria, you're at the heart of a debate in the Parliament trying to shape what the Commission is going to come up with in September in terms of the strategy. I know you're working hard, and I know you're in the middle of the negotiations about what that's going to finally look like. But your reflections on what Parliament's likely to want from the strategy will be very interesting at this point.
Allow me, thank you very much for the invitation, and allow me just to say a few things on the priorities that we have already tabled in the draft, starting with the way that we are working on having a chemical strategy for sustainability as a coherent policy and as a complementary policy regarding Circular Economy Action Plan 2, as a part of the framework of industrial strategy, and of course as a part of the plan of EU beating cancer. That's why the first priority for us is to upgrade the level of protection of the consumers and the environment, and that's why we are asking the Commission to include the provision to minimize animal tests. Concerning the strategy, the chemical strategy for sustainability, we have a very ambitious target. We are trying to create a legal framework in order to act as locomotive for a global approach in terms of standards. And the role of ECHA in this regard is extremely crucial. We are trying to start setting global standards And by this way, we are trying to build upon the existing regulatory framework and the legislation, the EU legislation, in terms of EU trade policy, in order to create a global level playing field concerning chemicals. It is extremely important for the implementation of the Green Deal, and I fully agree with Guy, because we need material, we need resources, and at the same time, we need to implement the circular economy aspects worldwide, and not only within EU. So this is our first ambitious goal. In this regard, we are putting some kind of priorities, starting with the enforceability of this strategy. Because as maybe you all know, we have a lot of issues concerning the implementation of the existing legislation within the EU, starting with REACH. So we are asking member states for full implementation of the existing legislation. But at the same time, we are looking at the way, how can we start enforcing the new strategy within member states with the coordination of regional local authorities and of course with the coordination of the industry. The third one parameter concerns the industry as such. We are asking the industry to coordinate with the authorities and to coordinate with the EU institution in order to have a wider approach in this regard, because we need the industry to take part not only on the implementation of our legislation, but also on the progress of R&D. That's why I'm fully in favor of facilitating the industry with all valuable financial instruments that we have, in order to accelerate the question of substance to safer substitutes. I would like just to conclude this very short intervention by saying that the main issue for all this is how can we have enough data. And in this regard, I fully support ECHA's initiative to establish a new platform that it will facilitate all of us. I mean, not only politicians, but also the scientists, stakeholders, and of course ECHA. And I would like to make a call in this regard to all participants in this webinar in order to start discussing on this case. We will organize an event in the Parliament under my capacity as a co-chair of the Indian group on the climate change and sustainable development. And I can kindly ask you to join us, because we will start debating on the issue of data very, very deeply. Thank you very much once again, and I'm at your disposal for further questions.
Thank you, Maria. Interesting, the idea of of data and how we use it. And I know there's big moves certainly in recent years. I know, Bjorn, you're starting to talk about open data and how we make more use of that. Clearly, Bjorn, one of the things that I think you're clearly proud of, and I think we all are proud of as Europeans, is the role that ECHA has played in bringing together so much knowledge around chemicals. I know that's been one of the first achievements of REACH and of ECHA as an organ. I guess we've also seen an evolution of what you're doing in terms of, now taking on more of the waste elements of legislation, the occupational exposure stuff that the RAC's now looking at. And I suppose here, what part of this debate is, as we move forward into the next strategy of the Commission, is, where do we go from here? And we've already heard, I think, mention of circularity. We've heard mention of climate and some of those big Green Deal challenges. I know you put some thought into this already, Bjorn, at ECHA. I'd be interested to know how you see the future and the kind of role that ECHA can play, but also what you think is needed in the chemical policy space to deliver on those Green Deal objectives. Bjorn.
Thanks a lot, and also for the nice words about ECHA. Indeed, I'm very proud of this organization, even though I've only been part of it for 2 years. So it's my predecessor and the staff who have done all the hard work, and I can take a little bit of the glory from it. Let me say a few words which are not metal specific, just what we see generally, and then in the discussion we can get into the specificities in metals, because there are many specificities on metals, both on the upside and the downside, which need discussion. But basically what we've been doing here in ECHA is reading very attentively all these documents that come out, in particular from the Commission. So the Europe Beating Cancer, the industry strategy, the circular economy 2.0, but also the Green Deal as such, the original political outline set up by President Ursula von der Leyen, but also the first initial thoughts coming out on the recovery plan. So there's the digital agenda, And we try to see, well, what is the consistent story that we see as a policy picture evolving from that for chemicals, and then looking at what can we do and basically offer it, saying this is what we could do to help this and this. And then, of course, hope that we will be given the task with the resources to do it. But in any case, the things that I'll mention in a moment are things that need to be done. So whether it's us or member states or somebody else for policy to decide, but this is what we think is needed. So the policy picture that we see deriving from all these documents, and therefore we expect to be in the chemical strategy, is effectively three messages that come out of it concerning chemicals in general. One is concerning energy. Clearly, climate neutrality has a huge impact on chemical industry, which is a huge energy demanding industry. And it needs, excuse me, and to address the energy and climate neutrality in 2050, there are two sides of the equation. There's one moving away from fossil energy sources to renewable energy sources, but the other one is also reducing the demand for the energy in the industry itself. And there are two ways of looking at that very generically in reduction of demand. It's changing the chemistry that we use to develop chemicals from chemistries that need high energy. We all know that from high school chemistry, that energy is always something that goes in on one side of the equation to get the other side. So focus on those chemical reactions that need less energy. And the other one is, of course, optimizing existing processes where recycling is something that comes into mind there as an issue. So that's the energy side. Then there's on the safety side, where we see quite a lot happening in these various documents. Effectively, an increased level of safety is being requested, where clearly we can play a role in defining what that actually means in terms of science that's needed in order to make which decisions. Addressing mixtures of chemicals, endocrine disruptors, those are elements of it. But one of the drivers that we also see on the safety side is to take the final step that actually started with REACH and continued with many revisions of current EU legislation in terms of getting more synergies and more consistency. And that is one of the things that I think we, at least at ECHA, have been able to demonstrate that it's possible, that by giving us tasks in other pieces of legislation, we can actually create through our work the linkages between REACH with classification and labeling over to the occupational safety and health, over to waste. And the more that these tasks are carried out simultaneously by the independent agencies, and here in the chemicals area, we're three, we're EFSA, ECHA, and EMA, the more consistency we can get out of it, but equally so, the more synergies we get, which means it's actually being done with less resources, which means we can do more with what we got. And I think that that's something which benefits the whole of Europe, whether you're on industry side, citizen side, or the authority side. If we can gain synergies and consistency and thereby predictability of what we're doing, that would greatly increase. So that's on the safety side. And then comes the circular economy side. That also puts new demands on chemistry. We want chemicals which are used in materials that then are circular. And basically circularity of a material, which is the backbone of the circular economy, is, it's three things. Either you reuse the article itself, you reuse the material, or you basically do chemical recycling, means that you take the material, you break it down, you extract the chemical, and you use that as the new feedstock for chemical manufacturing. And those are the three things you can do. And if you look at materials today, very, very few are circular. So therefore, the circular economy 2.0 demand on chemistry is that we need a lot of new chemistry in order to develop materials which are circular. In parentheses, metals are, of course, not the ones I'm talking about here. So this is where the metals part of the equation has one up when we get to circularity. But in general, in chemicals and materials, that is an issue. So that's where we basically see, from our perspective, that the new policy is putting demands on energy, higher demands on safety, and an additional demand on circularity of the chemicals that we manufacture. And I think if I put in short what we can do, we have some more details that we might be getting into. but we think that we could help defining what is a sustainable chemical that meets these three demands in the future, and then also help to implement it both within regulation, but also basically on the other side of the coin, which is innovation. We need some sort of partnership at EU level to ensure that we promote strongly innovation into how do we ensure circularity, how do we ensure the increased safety, how do we ensure lesser energy in order to get to the 2050 goal. And this is basically one where we concentrate each of us on what we're good at. And that's where ECHA in this equation can give the safety angle. Industry, of course, knows technology. They know how to use chemicals. They know how to recycle chemicals. That's what they're good at. But you need a partnership in order to get the ideal solution out of it between industry, authorities, academia, and agency like ours, and get the best of all the competences out there in order to get a thriving European, I would say, chemicals industry and thereby manufacturing industry.
Thank you, Bjorn. I mean, you ending there again with the partnership word, which I think is really interesting. That we'll explore that perhaps later in the conversation. Again, I look at the work that your Meta is already doing with ECHA, which looks great to me in terms of the data side at the beginning of the process. I'm guessing when it can come back to more partnership. I mean, a reflection also, Bjorn, but that maybe you can pick up on straight away is that working in partnership with industry is a very different kind of regulatory approach compared to the US, if I think about it, where there's quite often a pushback. Again, I'll compliment ECHA, I think, as an agency that really does engage with stakeholders really, really well. So actually, I'm not going to ask you for a comment. I'm just going to compliment you again. I'm going to stop doing that later. I look at, people are reminding me that the chat is indeed open. Please do in the chat ask questions. Some points already, and we have had a poll, which I'm going to come to in a second, but just to even reflect on some of the comments that have come in on the chat. Stein from the Copper Association, International Copper Association, talks about the energy element that we were just talking about. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, Stein, if I may. But Jochen, who's writing in, I think a lot of support there, and I think I said that at the beginning. A lot of support there for how do we make sure that the different moving parts of our legal instruments, whether it's OSHA legislation, REACH, are more coherent and have more consistency and use it. So I think, Bjorn, open door there, I think, for industry support. Let's come back onto that. Let's just have a little look at the chat, Guy, the polls. So we were having a poll there, which I failed to announce. Apologies, but those of you who have been online for the last 3 of these webinars know that it exists. And our question was, what was the highest priority? And we took, I think, 5 of the things that were mentioned in the lovely roadmap of the Commission that many people have already issued their consultation responses to: stronger legislation, regulatory coherence, innovation and competitiveness, knowledge and science, or the global dimension. Unsurprisingly, regulatory coherence, 52% of the people, and there is now about 120 of you participating from throughout Europe. 52% went for regulatory coherence. So maybe, Bjorn, Maria, we'll just start there, because I know for each of you that regulatory coherence piece is important. Bjorn, actually, I'll turn to Guy first of all. Regulatory coherence, Guy, between REACH, other pieces of chemical legislation, and other pieces of legislation. How is that affecting Umicore? Kind of what are the challenges you see there currently, and what kind of thing would you like to see Maria and Bjorn, and I suppose Commission in the first instance, come up with to solve some of the challenges you see in that regulatory coherence piece?
Thanks, Jim. This is a good one, because I didn't want to get into some of the specifics, but I have to use a specific example here. My good friend in the cobalt industry would not permit me to go without mentioning cobalt and some of the pressure that is being put on cobalt for exposure through the discussion with ECHA. And to me, that is a good example of coherence of policy. I mean, here it talks about regulatory, but I would call it larger policy coherence. I mean, definitely we have an issue here of a strong transition in our sources of energy, the need and demand for having material being used, such as cobalt. the emphasis on recycling, which is an industry that is not really established yet. I mean, end-of-life battery is not there. I mean, we don't have enough cars to sustain a real substantial business. So this is something that is kind of an unknown to some extent. So I think it's extremely important that we have consistency of policy, if that regulatory coherence maybe. Obviously the regulation has to be in sync with Europe, so we have a certain level of predictability. The last thing that industry wants is non-predictability. So, you know, and when you do investment, like we have done in Umicore, with our battery production or cathode production in Poland, you don't invest 400 million for 5 years. You invest for 20 years. So you want a system that is somewhat predictable, so that offers consistency in prediction, not at the cost of the environment, not at the cost of health and safety of the workers, but yet at the, you know, in a way that is coherent and consistent locally within the regulatory system. But I think also the global dimension is important, because you know, this business is not local anymore, it's global, and you know, and there's got to be some coherence at that level as well.
Okay. Maria, how about that from a Parliament perspective? I mean, I'm guessing no parliamentarian, I started life working for a Labour member on the Environment Committee, would ever stand up and say, you know, we don't want to protect the environment or human health. But clearly there is a challenge in terms of balance of the kind of chemical management objectives, and sometimes these wider goals that we have to create battery value chains, for example, to create circularity. Like, how does a politician see that balance? And if you and your colleagues in Parliament, if you come up with a formulation that you're happy with about where that balance should lie in the motion for resolution?
Well, I think that it is of extremely important to facilitate our industry and not to undermine its competitiveness. And we finally can combine it with the protection of the consumers and the environment, which is our first priority. So frankly speaking, I think that we have, first of all, to safeguard predictability. That's why I think that we have to finalize the strategy, the chemical sustainability strategy, taking into account all the issues that we face during the implementation of the existing legislation. It is a coherent approach, and it is a wider approach, and it will facilitate us in order to create a level playing field in terms of our global position in the market. The first one is this one. The second one is, how can we finally take into account the problems and the examples that we face, like cobalt, like the lovely one of Eurometaux, lead to Vismuthius. Vismuthius is a Greek word. And that means that we have to take into account not only the time that the industry needs in order to go ahead with safer substitutes, but also the terms and the aspect of the sustainability of this process. Because if we need millions of tons to replace lead with vismuth, then we finally create a larger problem to the environment instead of having lead in our products. So we have to have the assistance and, of course, the participation of ECHA in this regard. But at the same time, we need the proper legal instruments. That's why I think that the strategy is needed. The strategy must put the feet on the ground, not only in terms of protecting the environment, but also in terms of global market, safeguarding the circularity of our products and creating new markets, because we are now talking about circular economy and the products and in the services that circular economy is provided. And at the same time, we have not created and we have not the proper regulatory framework in order to have a coherent circular market within the EU. I have an example coming from my home country, Greece. That's why I'm asking for. But I think Greece, and not only the south, it is the case. I think that the case is the EU as a whole.
So thank you, Maria. So Bjorn, I took from Guy's comments, I mean, a normal plea for certainty from industry, but also certainty around industries that I think the EU, from a very a kind of public policy goal objective has kind of, specified. I mean, there with cobalt, you don't need to go into a cobalt salts restriction discussion, don't worry. But clearly a very clear example of an area where we want to invest. We decided we want a batteries value chain, and there might be a little bit of friction, a little bit of dissonance in there. I'm interested, Bjorn, from you, from just on the basis of those comments from Guy-Maria, two different elements about this coherence issue. So first of all, about the coherence and objectives, I don't think Guy or anyone else is going to say they don't want to protect workers or the environment. So we can discount that bit of it. But clearly, you work in an ECHA framework which is governed by legislation adopted by co-legislators. You're basically implementing rules that other people have come up with. I'm interested in how you see the current system allowing you to work, the current legislation allowing you to work, to take some of those other policy goals into account. So whether it's in the risk management options assessment area or whether it's in more the risk assessment area, how does socioeconomic factors get played into existing rulemaking, let's say? Leia from First Solar kind of asked that question in the chat, how can the energy driver be taken in, which I'm kind of guessing is climate and energy goals, into REACH when through REACH processes consider the socioeconomic dimension in their decision-making process. So that's one area I'd like you to explore, if you could, Bjorn. And then I think the other area, maybe we'll come on to, actually, let's explore that one first. Let's not stack the questions. How about that?
Okay.
Just stay at the interlink between what you've already got and these wider objectives that have come up in the Green Deal. Can you do that already in your existing framework, do you think?
I think we can do a lot within the existing framework. Basically, in terms of the way we deal with chemicals in the EU, but also, around the world, is you always have a scientific technical bit and then you have the policy bit. The policy bit is normally called risk management. Now in Europe, we have a different balance between risk management and technical stuff than in the US. We do a lot of the analysis that enables a risk management decision. But let's not get into that detail, but let's split it up into technical and policy decision making. And I think on the technical side, we can do a lot within the current framework. There are basically two legs. I will talk just 3 seconds on the one, which is the data. I believe we're very far in terms of having the tools that enable us to actually collect all the data that's relevant for any chemical and make it available to anybody who's taken a decision on it, which for me is a prerequisite for enabling consistency. At the moment, when EFSA does an assessment, they are restricted to do an assessment on some data, we on other data, somebody else on a third data, which obviously means that things become not coherent or at least not very consistent. So that's one area. And it fits beautifully into the digital agenda because Europe is probably the region in the world which has the most structured data in the files of authorities and companies around. And if we would unlock that, we could generate a digital economy using this type of data, chemicals data, health data, whatever, which is much more potential than, for example, some of the giants in the US, which use tons of data, which is very shallow. But we have tons of data that is very deep. The potential there is amazing. And extorting that data potential is exactly what drives innovation into the chemistry and chemicals we want in the future. So I won't talk more about data, but the digital agenda of Europe is an enormous potential if we unlock the data. Put that one aside. Look at one substance, one assessment, which I think is the term that the Commission uses. Parliament has it in their draft resolution. And there we see on the assessment side, so the work that we do, also quite a lot of potential for doing it more integrated, and even start adapting towards what is it that the policymaker wants us to assess in this broader Green Deal context, which includes energy, it includes circularity, it includes the objective of zero pollution, for example. And that's where I think the existing tools, the existing legislative framework is there. If I look at REACH, it can include, for example, energy considerations. It's just that we don't yet have the tools there, or rather, we've not been asked to develop them. I think they exist, and it's an issue of developing them and putting them in
Bjorn,
framework.
where would you include that energy element then? Is that in the
part of the
substance evaluation
socioeconomic-
or the in
part of the
socioeconomic assessment?
socioeconomic analysis? If you're looking at the risk management part of REACH, restrictions and authorization, but it could also be part of the registration part if it gets pulled down to being an element that industry should consider as part of their safety. That's of course in the longer run, and that would need changes to the annexes of REACH, but not to REACH as such. So there are a number of things that basically one could do that.
While we're on the question of energy, because Bjorn, it did refer to something that you said, and I know in the articles that I've been reading in recent days in trade media, we've seen kind of your view expressed about the 3 different areas that sustainable chemical for you looks at. Stein said, regarding your point on energy, the energy needed to produce a chemical is only one side of the equation. The other one is the contribution of a chemical can make to energy efficiency technologies and products. How can this be considered? And I looked at what you said and certainly what I've been reading around that, and it seemed to be you were looking at the manufacturing of the actual of the chemical itself. And here we're talking about inorganic chemicals, non-ferrous metals, but you'd be looking at that. Do you already factor in something that we see on ETS and other areas, which is about, you know, the rules here potentially leading to us producing these things outside of Europe and pushing them in via articles rather than as substances? If you go down that route, have you factored that kind of thinking into your equation at the moment?
I mean, thanks. There are many thoughts that can hang together, some falling within ECHA's competence, some outside. And if I focus first on the ones that are basically within our competence, I mean, fundamentally, of course, the right thing to do from a scientific perspective is to do a full life cycle, complete assessment of all chemicals on the market and all future chemicals in order to determine which ones are the right ones. Now, we all know that that's impossible simply because the cost of collecting the information by industry to enable a full life cycle assessment of a chemical is enormous, and therefore is not worthwhile for most chemicals. And therefore, our stance or our proposal here, when we're looking at what are the extended elements that would, or I shouldn't use elements with metal industry, sorry, the extended factors that have an impact, could have an impact in the future in what is a sustainable chemical, is also bound by practicalities. So what we think is, well, if you take what we have now and you extend it a bit, what elements that in that extension would be practical and would be something that we have for all chemicals so that we can still make the choices between chemicals, because that's ultimately what it's all about. It's a relative choice, not so much an absolute choice. And that's where we think that, of course, energy consumed or used or saved down the supply chain plays a role. But when we start asking that question, then the data collection to be able to make this relative choice between all the chemicals becomes so big that either we get analysis by paralysis, or the cost on industry to collect the information gets so enormous that we won't be able to take these decisions in a cost-effective way. So what we think, what can relatively easily be done is simply look at the upstream bit, which we anyway do in REACH. We're looking at upstream and then looking what then happens, but the focus is upstream. And there we can look at the energy in producing the chemicals. And I completely agree that there is also a lot other downstream. But there's the same in a safety assessment. That's, let's say, we very often don't look into in great detail simply because the collection of the information is limited. We have to learn where to scope it.
Bjorn, thank you for that in terms of kind of clarifying how you're thinking about it. Guy, I'm going to come to you on that point because I know you do a lot of life cycle thinking. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to touch upon one of the things that, Bjorn, you were talking about. Kai from the Nickel Institute has written on the chat to say, what would be the best tool to achieve the integrated consideration between different policy fields and the chemical policy? Would it not be better to consider the impact of other policy objectives before a risk management option is chosen? So I'm guessing as part of the member state process of RMOAs. I always struggle on that. Not after it's being implemented in effect. Maybe that would be the better option. To the best moment might be the RMOAs, which I know we have issues over consistency and how they're done by member states, which might be outside of the remit of ECHA. As always, the problem with this club is its members. Guy, though, let's just turn to you on that question. We're thinking about energy. We're thinking about how do we factor in energy in a sustainable chemical. And here we're talking about non-ferrous metals, clearly. How do we factor that in for some of the metals that you deal with? How does what's Bjorn saying there, how does it hit you as someone who thinks a lot, I know, about the life cycle of his products?
Yeah, well, I was listening to what you were saying, Bjorn. I gonna sort of address it directly to the lower picture on my screen anyway. And I think, when we're into this energy transition, we've embarked collectively as society, I think it'd be a huge mistake not to go through the effort of the upstream and the downstream. The use element is so important as well, and we might have to make some compromise there in terms of the entire value chain. So the decision on the type of material and chemical to be used in the technology. I mean, I was hearing your conversation about sort of the policy around the organic chemicals, if I can use this terminology, and I can understand what you're saying from my background. But I think with metals and this energy transition, again, I come back to this, we need to have a totally different mindset. It is a totally new approach. I jokingly in other conference said that we cannot make the mistake that Rockefeller and Ford have made at the turn of the industrial century in 1900. Today we have a lot of data. You've said it, but that data has to be taken into the entire value chain. So life cycle becomes extremely important, and we're going to have to make decisions, policy decisions, on that basis, and that's where the compromise will have to happen. We were talking earlier about consistency of policy. This is one of the area I think is so essential right now, is that we have that right balance in order to achieve this resilience of Europe with no carbon energy, and yet at the same time, and James, you've said it, we're dead shift on protecting our workers, protecting the environment, protecting the people that lives around us. So we're going to have to make those compromises, and I think these elements of life cycle are going to be so critical.
Now, thanks, Guy. Maybe I wanted to bring you in and maybe move the conversation on slightly to circularity. We've opened our second poll. Today I'm doing an absolutely very bad job at announcing the poll's being open, but the poll is open on circularity and what the barriers are for circularity. What Guy mentioned there, I think, was a plea also for, and Bjorn, you mentioned it in your opening remarks about the specificities of metals. And it's perhaps an observation for me as someone who has actually worked on chemical policy since starting here 20 years ago, is quite often we do tend to think towards the organics, right? And we tend to do inorganics. I remember going back to the zinc risk assessment. We try to look at inorganics and we try to get a square peg in a round hole sometimes, because the system seems to be focused more on organics. I want to just jump on that idea that maybe we need a specific approach and talk about circularity a little bit, which was one of the topics that you all mentioned as really very, very important. So Maria, age-old discussion, and it's in the chat, risk versus hazard. And when I hear the refrain, I think Mr. Sadaukas did it earlier this week. I saw Mr. Claire Crespo up in Helsinki at the last chemicals forum I was at, after the great stakeholder days of ECHA. Another plug for ECHA. Please do go to Helsinki. I remember Daniel Claire Crespo standing on the platform and saying in one breath, metals were a great example of circularity. And then the second breath, but in order to get circularity, we need to get rid of all of these hazardous chemicals. And I see it again in the roadmap from the Commission. They talk about, I think, that 75% of the chemicals on the marketplace are still hazardous, and we must get rid of them. And yet here we have quite often in the metal sector, there are some metals. Guy mentioned, I think, lithium and cobalt. I think some of the compounds there have got hazard profiles. but we are looking to recycle them and reuse them, and they're very essential for some of the objectives we have. Maria, does that nuance get lost when we talk about the circularity argument, when you get to your colleagues in the Parliament, that actually there may be some of these things that are exceptionally precious to enable the Green Deal, but some of them might be hazardous, but we might need them in a circular economy anyway. In fact, they're the ones that probably are very circular already. Does it get lost?
No. You put a lot of issues on the table, and I would like just to start.
That was a rant. I'm sorry.
Yes, I would like to start addressing the first one that Bjorn has already raised concerning the unlock of data. I think it is the key for most of them. If we finally take a political decision to go ahead by unlocking data, then we will facilitate our lives. And of course, we will protect the consumers, the environment, and we will increase the capacity of the industry. It is of extremely important to take a breath and go ahead with unlocking the data. This is, according to my opinion, the first one. The second one is the energy cost and the energy use that we are doing in the EU, and especially where the energy comes. It is extremely important to understand that if we finally have energy coming from renewable sources, then the energy cost will be lower, and of course it will provide us with less greenhouse emissions, and finally it will fulfill one of the standards of the circularity that we need. And now the case, circularity of metals. I think that now we have to understand that R&D is needed. And R&D is needed most of all because we need to understand that without R&D that will be supported by all stakeholders, we cannot finally have a full circular economy concerning raw materials. So we need something that it is a platform, it is the horizon, but it will provide the adequate financing in order to facilitate R&D. And we need, of course, to have on the table all the basic parameters of circularity. I have already mentioned the example concerning lead in order to replace it with bismuth, but it is also the cobalt issue that we face. And according to the Commission, we had a debate during this week on the issue of chemical strategy. We cannot have right now a kind of credible circular process concerning cobalt. So it is important to understand that we have a lot of gaps in this framework, and we need to fulfill these gaps. How can we fulfill these gaps? By facilitating R&D, by involving all stakeholders, starting with industry, because industry has the problem, and industry maybe can finally resolve the problem with the assistance and the participation of the universities and research centers. So I think this is the case for us. We don't need further legislation. We don't need another circular action plan. We don't need other legislative instrument. We need just to work on the existing legislative framework, and we need to fulfill the gaps of implementation that we have.
Thank you, Maria. I just want to pick up on what we need to get to ensure that we get more safe recycling happening in Europe. So the poll is still open, guys. If you haven't voted, but we asked the question: what is the highest priority to ensure the safe recycling of hazardous substances in the metals industry? The high one actually was 42%. Ensure metals are treated by recyclers meeting environmental standards, so standards for recyclers. I know that's going to come up in our batteries discussion that we're about to have. 24% said strengthen occupational health and safety legislation. So I know, Bjorn, you're now at least looking at the risk assessment side of that at ECHA, and probably that coherence thing may hopefully help in time on that one. What was my next one? 18% prevent exports to low quality recyclers abroad. So 18% of you on the phone from the metals, on the line from the metals industry around Europe. 11% said improve information on presence of hazardous substances in products. And then only 3% said remove hazardous substances from material loops as the priority. Guy, this is your business, isn't it, at Umicore? Cobalt. recycling, trying to get as much cobalt back in a closed loop as humanly possible. What do you see as the barrier here, and where does the hazardous bit fit into this?
Yeah, well, I think the poll is good there, because if you join the sort of the treatment into facility that are environmentally adequate, if I can use this term, and the export to low quality recycler, I mean, that's basically a common element. The common philosophy there is, recycling has to happen in facilities that are inhibiting or protecting the environment, protecting the health and safety of the workers. And there again, I mean, like we're back to part of the conversation at the beginning, is that we need consistency into the approach here. And that consistency is not going to happen only in Europe. I mean, definitely we want to retain these material in Europe as much as we can, but, we have a global market. So, I mean, all of this is integrated. But at the end of the day, though, the objective is to have the right level of requirements and measure in place to protect the environment and to the workers. So at Umicore, this is essential for us. I mean, like you say cobalt, but we're a big recycler of precious metal. That's our prime business, and we've been promoting this consistency of treatment on a global basis. So having standards in order to be evaluated and to ensure that material are recycled in a proper fashion. But it is essential. It is essential. Recycling is essential, and recycling is essential for ensuring resilience of resources.
And out of those things, so you kind of agree, Guy, did you, with the prioritization that the wider metal industry gave to what we needed to focus on?
I agree.
Nothing stood out there and said.
Yeah. I agree, James, with if you combine ensure metal are treated by recycler meeting environmental standard and prevent export to low quality recycler, because at the end of the day it is the same thing. I mean, you prevent to low quality recycler because you don't have the consistency of the policy. So you need to have a policy on a global basis, and then the market can operate.
Bjorn, can I turn to you then on this question? Because so you have already kind of wandered into circularity, I know, and you'll be happy to know that, indeed, I know the database that you're working on under the Waste Framework Directive, right, is about hazardous substances in articles, right? So there is some support out there in terms of prioritization for that. You started in your remarks about the specificities of metals, right? And I just wonder in this circularity context, whether we think a little bit too much, and when I say we, I suppose I mean the chattering public of Brussels and Helsinki, do we think a little bit too much about plastics and the organics here, and do we kind of lose the inorganic story a little bit when we're thinking about it? I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. I find it funny. I was at a Perm rep, and they told me, the metals industry do something like the Circular Plastics Alliance, and I'm thinking to myself, guys, like, they look at their recycling rates, look at their collection rates, and yes, so I forgive our member states sometimes for those kind of comments. But
sorry, I've laughed.
You shouldn't laugh about member states, but you can laugh at me. I'm just interested. So the specificity of metals here in this circular debate, do we get lost a little bit from your perspective? I know you're one step removed because the policy kind of making is done at Commission, but do we get forgotten about, do you think, or should we read when they say hazardous chemicals should be got rid of, should we say, okay, but they don't really mean us, right? Because they know we need cobalt compounds for batteries, right? Or that we need nickel compounds for this. Should we be worried, or should we think actually those guys at the Commission, they've got it, they know that we're different?
Well, I mean, for me, it all fits into the same picture. I mean, of course, metals are special, but to be quite honest, I've not seen a risk assessment of any chemical where that chemical was not special, some way or the other. So I don't like to categorize because every chemical has its difficulty in assessing, has its specificity in use, everything. And at least the way I see it all is whether you're looking at a plastic or whether you're looking at a metal. The three components, the energy, the safety, and the circularity, are the three that are seem from all these policy documents to be the most relevant. Now, once you start plugging in your chemicals into each of these scenarios, you come up with a different conclusion. I mean, if you come up with the organics with plastics, well, in circularity, they don't score very high because there's no plastic that's circular. All plastics are linear with loops. And you know, the maximum loop is maybe 6, 7, or 8. Or you can get infinite loops by just continuously adding primary material. So you're still linear. Metal scores high. Metals are circular. I mean, gold coins are kept for thousands of years, but they're also melted down over and over again. So metals score high there. In the middle bit, the safety bit, they're unfortunate, mainly toxic. But we can get to that one in a moment, because that just puts another conditionality on the use of the substances to ensure that that toxicity is taken good care of. The energy bit for metals is also very specific. So actually, in my view, for metals, if you look at it very globally, then the main issue is the safety. Because over on the energy, if we are looking at circular economy, then the recyclers of the future are the manufacturers of the future. They're one and the same. So, I mean, Guy, you are the future of metals manufacturing, right? Which therefore, for me, in terms of metals and the energy bit, is all about, and I don't want you to see which type of phone this is, but I'll put my finger over it. But I mean, the issue, if we want circularity, we want an economy that extracts all the metals from this phone. Now, the metal itself is the metal itself, but the extraction can be done with less energy, depending on the materials that are put in and how they're put into a phone. So how the phone is designed, but also all the other materials. I mean, right now, when Guy extracts the copper from a electrical cord, you have to burn off the plastic, which is a lot of energy and actually a lot of waste. Now, if we would be able to insulate with something else where you wouldn't need to burn, but you could, I don't know, dissolve at room temperature in water or at 100 degrees, and then start processing the pure copper, that will use less energy. So that's what I mean with production. I mean, production is one thing today. In a circular economy, production and recycling is the same thing. It's waste mining that we are going to be doing, but at high-tech level. So there I completely agree with Guy. Just two little remarks that I simply can't resist. What I always prefer is to not use the word versus. You know, you have the hazard versus risk. You have precaution versus innovation. My view, which maybe is just simply cynical after many years, is that if you use the versus, it's because you want a conflict, because you don't want it resolved. Whereas if you use the and word, you actually recognize that they're two sides of the same coin that fit beautifully together. Innovation, precaution fit beautiful together. Hazard versus and risk fit beautifully together. But that's a different topic. Just I can't resist saying this. Sorry. And then on the RMOA bit, which is a vocabulary that even parliamentarians are putting in their words, even though it's a very technical term. So I do dare put it forward here. If the conditionality is that you want a transparent process where industry and NGOs can be involved, where the output has been properly screened by independent scientists, and all done with full scrutiny and transparency, then it's called an Annex 15 dossier within the restrictions process of REACH. So if that's what you want, and I would greatly support it, because that's what I think, then let's build a broad restrictions process within the current REACH restrictions that always ends up with what is the right answer to regulate a substance, rather than try to develop or formalize a less comprehensive, less informed machinery beforehand, which it seems to me that some people want. But in any case, if you want transparency, independence, and full consistency, it is Article 69 in REACH.
But that's just for clarity. That's just the restrictions process, correct? So you've already made a choice about your risk management tool at that point as you go into a restrictions process.
That's not what Article 69 says, but it is how it's being applied today. Article 69
Okay,
says
so
if-
it could be applied differently. It could be allowed to use different kinds of.
for example, the outcome of restriction could be that the best thing to do is set an OEL.
Okay.
That's at least what the legal text says. It's not what we do today.
Okay, so we could innovate in our regulatory processes, which sounds interesting. Just out of interest, also, I mean, once you enter an Article 69 process, how many substances have gone through Article 69 process to not have a restriction at the end? Is there many that have had a dossier but then not had ended up with a restriction?
They very often do, and that's exactly because the conditionality that's put on right now is let's make sure we only put substances into the process that end up in amending Annex 17 of REACH, very technical terms. But if you look at it objectively, and here I take just one example, if you look at the Chemical Agents Directive, which is there to protect workers from exposures to chemicals in the same way as REACH is there to protect workers from exposures to chemicals, then the Chemical Agents Directive has two risk management measures at its disposal. It sets either an OEL or it bans the chemical. REACH has many more. So if you want to figure out what is actually the most cost efficient way of dealing with the risk, then the best way of doing it is within a restrictions proposal to say, is banning it better than setting an OEL, or is actually setting an OEL in combination with another instrument the best thing to do? So if you make that decision up front, automatically you will never get the optimum. You will always get less protection at higher cost. By definition.
Interesting. I think an interesting discussion, which I think not only member states you might have to have that discussion with, I'm guessing you already do, but some of our industry colleagues, because there's some disagreement in the chat that that's a possibility. So I guess that's
I'm being provocative, I know, and sorry, Maria, this is rather technical.
We did go a little bit down the rabbit hole.
It's still interesting, joke.
Let us come out. So we've got lots of people disagreeing with you, Bjorn. But let's come out of the rabbit hole, because we have reached our hour by my watch, and maybe a slightly bit over. Just before we leave everyone for the last time, could I just ask each of you a question? So if there's, it's the usual question, you know what I'm going to ask is, if there's one thing, Guy, just one thing though, okay? One thing that you would ask the Commission to focus on in this upcoming strategy, what would be that one practical thing that they could do for Umicore that would continue to get you to invest? The one thing, and then I'll ask Maria and Bjorn.
Consistency of policy and predictability.
Give us predictability, says the industry. Maria, what does the Parliament say?
I will be very complimentary to Guy, because I strongly believe that we have to create a global level playing field in this regard. That's why I'm asking ECHA to support our efforts in order to build upon the existing legislation and go ahead with setting standards at the global level.
Super, global level, we like that. And we didn't quite get into that whole thing where actually our lovely REACH standards might be global standards as well, not just due to regulators, but also due to industry adopting them elsewhere in the world. Great.
Yes, but it is, allow me to say, it is of paramount importance to understand that we have to have the same standards for chemicals that are produced and used within EU, with chemicals that we're importing and with chemicals that we're exporting. It is extremely important to create a level playing field, and at the same time we will have consistency and predictability. I think that we can fulfill all the requirements that we're asking for.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Bjorn, sentence from you. What would you like to see your former colleagues do?
It's very, very simple. I agree with Guy. I agree with Maria. Those are the two main factors.
Perfect. At that point, I will say thank you, all three of you, for an entertaining debate. I think I could have carried on a little bit longer talking about it, but we'll let people go and have some lunch. Thank you to all of the members of the metals industry across Europe who joined us, not only for this webinar, but for the series of 4. We hope in the lockdown it's actually been an interesting way to spend a lunchtime, debate some of the issues that the metal industry is facing. And it's been a pleasure on my part to have some interesting conversations with different people on all related subjects. I will wish you for the last time a good afternoon. And I will also say to you, as we do exit lockdowns, please do stay safe. Okay, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very, very much.